So, many of you had just sort of chatted a little bit. I mean, you're all in fairly large fairly large engineering organizations, or at least, where the engineering organizations sort of outscale you as individual observability or monitoring teams. And so, monitoring is often in your titles, or reliability is often in your titles, or insights, similar terms. Where does the responsibility of monitoring and observability fall within your organization? Is that something that your teams are, handling for the rest of engineering and product and and business, or is it falling with you? And maybe we start at the end with Datadog and kind of work back this way.
Sure. So we're dog fooding our own product all the time. We try, and the SRE team itself tries to set some baselines. Is always concerned about capacity planning. But we really, as a company, want everybody involved setting up metrics, monitoring, observability.
Yeah, so I think we don't have an SRE team, we don't have a NOC, we don't have an operations team. So that means that every engineer who writes code runs code. And so I like to say that the person who's on call for your product is really the person who should own the instrumentation and monitoring of that said thing. And so that's certainly the case at Twilio. We have, I think, in the order of 60 small teams at this point. And so my team kind of sets up guidelines and best practices, does a lot of education. But from a responsibility standpoint, it's certainly on the engineers and on the individual teams to decide how they want to tackle this problem.
I think we're set up the same way. Obviously, me being a team of one, I'm not going to do it all. I've never wanted, I'm part of the SRE org, so there's other people on the team. We strive very hard to make sure that everybody in SRE doesn't necessarily have to know every single service. We try to push back to the engineers as much as possible. They're the ones doing integration testing. They're figuring out how it works. And we help educate and set things up, and we try to kind of preach an idea and a goal for us to get to, and kind of crowdsource getting there.
Again, very, very similar to all of the above. The individual teams are responsible for setting up their own metrics and controlling. You saw the example earlier with use the JSON file to have that captured in code so that we can talk about it and review it in pull requests across the org. Different teams are also responsible for kind of common frameworks sometimes, where it's like multiple teams are involved in a service. So somebody will basically put out, here's the framework that will be watching these metrics. It's on the individual service owning teams to make sure that they're defining the right metrics for them.
So, Josh, you mentioned integration testing, and so I'm kind of curious, do you see a relationship between QA and monitoring, or how do those two fit together? Is it two sides of a similar coin, like the same coin, or?
I think they're very related. I've always tried to get monitoring in as soon as possible. I've come from companies where it's the last thing, where I started the company and find something's been running in prod for 2 years and is not monitored. So I try to work with companies work with the engineers to say, let's get it in right away. I don't care if it's dev metrics we have to throw away later, or if they're meaningless because you're experimenting, but get them in now, and then you get an idea of how it's going to trend over time.
Cool. So I think it'd be, many of us, if we were to discover a service that's being deployed to production, we're like, oh, there's no unit tests, there's no integration tests. Where's the test coverage on this? We'd kind of throw our hands up in the air and sort of run screaming from the room. How do those tests relate to the types of things that you're putting together monitoring wise?
I think for the stuff that doesn't have any existing framework for it, you start to just look at the behaviors and you kind of attack it from outside in, and then you figure out who the service owner is and start to get your internal instrumentation done. But for a lot of the services anybody uses these days, you start to look at RPS and latency and availability, and you can kind of look at every single internal service as a web service and kind of figure out if it's healthy or not, and then figure out how to get inside there.
So do you see the types of integration tests that your QA teams might run? Do you see those as being potentially good sources for monitoring?
Right, yeah, so
places to start?
Right, when you're doing your testing and you're saying, yes, I know this software works, I'm ready for it to go to stage or to prod, you map what you saw to make it work into your monitoring so that you can follow that through the system.
Nice. Cool. Similarly on a QA approach, I'm kind of curious, how are you all, we talked about we decentralized monitoring. We've said it's the problem, it's as a service owner, you're responsible for your monitoring, you're responsible for keeping your service online and deployed. it's sort of a double-edged sword though as well, right? We've all worked with a team that gets 10,000 alerts a week, and you say, are you checking all of those? And they say yes, and you say, well, that's more alerts than there are, than there is time in the day. How are you doing this? So how do what's sort of the feedback loops that you're using as you're trying to figure out how to avoid pager fatigue, make sure that the alerts are, strong signal to noise ratio? Are there any strategies that you all have adopted? Bruce, I think you had some strong opinions on this.
So I think the pager fatigue and like signal to noise ratio is actually like it self-incentivizes yourself to actually go do something about it. But I think there's an education gap, and I think there's a tooling gap. And so that's why introducing something like chaos or failure in an earlier stage helps you it gives your teams the tools they need to actually iterate on that signal to noise ratio. If you don't cause failure, trying to iterate on that signal to noise ratio, it's like, great, I think I tuned the alert, and then let's wait 2 months for the next outage to happen. And oh, nope, still got a 10,000 alerts. And so,
the other way around, didn't get any alerts.
right, right, exactly. And so actually being able to validate that is part of I think it's part of the inherent problem. And I think once you give developers an easy means to actually do the right thing and taking away a lot of that cognitive load, a lot of this will just happen. You don't need to tell people like, hey, your signal to noise ratio is bad. Like, they know they've gotten paged, right? But I think it's understanding and having empathy for like, why is this difficult? Why is it hard to validate whether you have good alerting or not?
I'm here representing Datadog, and obviously data is in the name, so I'm big on metrics. Of course, yes, pain-driven, sort of pain-driven operations or development is one way to go about it, and I think, folks will definitely respond to negative stimuli and try to improve the situation. But I often see it as our roles in the world of observability to help give people the tools, like you mentioned, Bruce. I'm curious if anybody has any stories maybe on how you've built that feedback loop, or ways that maybe things that you're doing to help your customers within your internal customers do a better job with their alerting and their monitoring.
Sure. So for Datadog, for example, we took, Corey gave a great talk from Stripe about, creating a feedback loop, giving a form for every alert, actually saying, is this actionable? Is it clear to me? Do I know what to do with it? And, collecting that data up front, and then being ruthless about having on-call handoffs and going through the list. That's the one, 10 times it has alerted, it's got no action. Well, get rid of it, you're not doing anything with it. So really cut the noise.
And I think you've built some tooling around that, just sort of POCs for within the world of Datadog.
Right.
Maybe afterwards, if folks are interested, Chris around could probably tell you a little bit about how he built that. And, but yeah, anybody else have any thoughts or ideas? I mean, obviously there's. I know you're with PagerDuty, Eric. You probably got some awesome tools to tell us about.
We page and people get tired. No. So they're kind of the two competing pressures on alert thresholds. Is our Failure Friday, our version of a game day, is where those are where the thresholds kind of get adjusted up, because that's again a controlled environment where we're inducing some sort of failure, and one of the first checks is, okay, sudo halt. And then 5 minutes later, everyone's kind of staring at each other. Did you get it? I didn't get it. Did you get a page? I didn't get it. And so that selection pressure kind of pushes the alert thresholds up. Then we've got our reporting and our metrics, and all of the team, either team lead or the engineering manager for each team will basically on a weekly or bi-weekly basis look at how many, how many did we get? Did we get 10,000? Okay, they're kind of proactive about, I'm not even going to wait for my team to complain about this. I'm just going to go start looking at these with the team every week. And does this feel like a lot? Is this not enough?
Nice.
And that drives the alerting thresholds back down usually.
Cool. So one of the things that I look around the room and at the folks that are in the audience and the folks that are on the panel here, and you kind of get the feeling that monitoring is this engineering-centric or IT-centric domain, right? We at least in the way that we often talk about it. It's like, I got an alert in the middle of the night about a web server being down, or maybe about a cluster, behaving slightly differently. As we're focusing on observability, though, the idea is to, get a sense of, the inputs and outputs of our organization as a whole, not necessarily just individual hosts or containers or APIs, but how is our organization as a whole in terms of health? Have you had any successes or challenges in getting some of these metrics to be more relevant to the wider organization? Is there anything that anything that you've been able to do to kind of get this in front of product folks, in front of folks on the sales and business side and other parts of the organization? I think we talk about DevOps and this idea that like, oh, it's just Dev and Ops, and in reality it's this idea of working across all of the organizational silos. So love to hear any stories you all might have and kind of how you might do it differently or the same.
Yeah, I don't know that I could come at it from a win perspective, but we run, I think right now, 25 different monitoring systems in order to catch internal, external, BGP, threshold around the world, and so where I've built like feedback loops into our Datadog alerts to say, was this useful? That's 1 out of 25 of our systems. And not all of them are set up to page. Some of them, are just Slack notifications that people mute, I assume, looking at the volume of them. So, I think that there's a place there to get more analytics on multiple systems as a whole and to figure out exactly, what we're looking at internally and externally. Trying to figure out, is our service healthy is, far different than is this machine healthy? You should be able to let machines fall apart, no worries. But if your latency is growing around the world, then you've got something else to look into.
Sure. Have you had much success in terms of, so as you're defining these metrics that are important to you to page yourselves and your teams, have you found metrics that sort of fit into what the business side of the organization might be, to make them relevant to them as we're bringing them all into the same sort of idea of let's share all the data and make good decisions as a team?
I think for Fastly in particular, looking at it from the customer's perspective. So we watch the error rates and origin hits, and are we going to melt somebody's origin server because our cache isn't holding on to something? And that's very big on the business side. That's the customer's going to call them about those specific stats. And so we make sure that we track those first and foremost. And they are side by side with system metrics at this point, but trying to get them pushed together. But
would you call those the work metrics? I think we all learned from Jason earlier today about work metrics and resource metrics.
Yeah. Those are the big ones. Those are we put our homepage has our requests per minute in real time, all the time on there. So that's always fun. When you go to look on there, and we just recently hit 5 million RPS. Consistent at peak, and so we're pushing a lot of data and handling a lot of requests, and we can do that with allowing machines to fall apart and switches to die and regular just hardware things to happen. So keeping those external metrics up is what you're looking for, because that's what your customer's looking for, and that's what your salespeople are pushing when they get out there.
So I was going to add, PagerPane solves a plethora of sins. At Twilio, we actually put our product managers on call. And so our product managers get paged also. So when that product is down, they're getting paged. It's amazing what happens to your backlog of like reliability and instrumentation betterments when you put a product manager on call. The other thing I think that helps is as an infrastructure provider, as a SaaS provider, we all have status pages. And I would hope that the product manager is the best person equipped to communicate about how the product fails or does not fail. And so I think that actually helps improve our process and improve how we think about communicating externally, how we think about communicating internally, and also like what telemetry do we need to have confidence in that communication about any issues that we might be seeing.
So are you able to loop them in, for example, on like things like as you're deciding how to gracefully degrade, what does that, how to make those calls, or?
Right. So I think there's a measure of education about failing open, failing close, what the differences are. So educating product managers about that, because I think those are product and business decisions about how you need to fail open or closed. And that's a call that a product manager or a business person actually needs to be educated and make. If you let engineering make all those decisions, then it may or may not be what's best for the business. And so there's a level of education that's necessary. But I also think from just understanding, like we have many sayings at Twilio. One of the sayings we also have is wear the shoes of your customers. And we just feel like this is one of the most important ways that a product manager can connect with the experience our customers are having if they actually feel that pain. And one of the things I always say at Twilio is, you might be pissed at 3 a.m. in the morning when you got paged, but guess what? Our outage just set off everyone else's pagers. It's like, when there's another cloud that goes down and we get paged about that, that's the same thing that happens. And so building that empathy in your organization, have all the way from the top, all the way through product, all the way through engineering, I think that's where PagerPane really solves that.
Related, something we're kind of discovering internally in PagerDuty is, this goes to more the broader business. PagerPane translates to things that aren't traditionally considered PagerPane. So we have a site that's just a kind of a static content site or whatever, and it's not really something that the SRE team is going to dive into. It's not something that's going to page anybody on the infrastructure or engineering teams at 3 a.m. because it's just hosted third party. But the marketing team really cares about it. And they really care about it in both they want it to be up and available, and they're responsible for calling the provider when it's not. They also have Google AdWords spend. And they want to immediately turn that down because they're now literally throwing money into the trash because they're buying this traffic or whatever with their AdWords and then sending it to a site that's down. And we're finding they were a little unnerved by the idea of being on call, but then they were explained that they worked at PagerDuty. And they went on call, and again, it's one of those things where the metrics are important for the business, and then you connect it to the rest of this tool chain that's trying to get that attention and trying to get that right level of effort on it, and it works pretty well.
Cool. I'll also add that I think it also starts from the leadership. It starts from the top. I've been in postmortems where Jeff, our CEO, will come into the postmortem and participate. And so, I think all of my years at Netflix, I never saw the CEO go to a single postmortem, right? That doesn't mean it's not important, but I think it sets a very, very different tone, especially in a startup setting when the CEO and founder is actually attending and even running the postmortems.
We get that a lot. Archer's in most of our meetings. The one thing I've really loved about working at Fastly is that everybody there is very excited when it's working right and very worried when it's not, and it's across the entire organization. So when something does go wrong, admin folks come in and say, do we need to order pizza, we need to get some drinks, take care of people, and you end up with a ton of people in your incident room, which is actually almost a problem in itself, that we have too many people in there chatting, too many business people saying, hey, do I need to reach out to this customer and that customer? And you say, okay, that's a side conversation for you guys to figure out. Let's figure out the actual problem in here. But everybody's very involved, and it's been, whereas we don't have to put people on call, they have some metric that alerts them out of Salesforce or something weird that they pop in when you don't expect them. And it's generally very helpful to have somebody that's, tuned to customer communication, hop in there at good times.
So, we talked a little bit about postmortems here. There was, Jason led an interesting session earlier about postmortems. And you mentioned, Bruce, you mentioned your CEO popping in. You mentioned your CTO popping in, Josh. How are you do you find yourselves including product and other organizations within parts of the organization within your postmortems? Purposefully, are they on the invites for these things? Or are they popping in because they're interested? How are you increasing engagement with a wider organization?
Our last big postmortem that we did, we made a live Zoom meeting. And so we had people in the room that were there to deal with the details and go over the incident that happened. But we left it open for anybody to drop in and start listening and watching with the request that they didn't start chiming in all the time. But, kind of just be a passive audience, and they get an idea of how we go through an incident, how we address certain issues, and they may come back later with their own ideas. But we try to leave it open to pretty much anybody that is interested in looking.
Are you able to loop them in when you're, so you're coming up with action items, and as somebody who occasionally plays, product manager and also occasionally plays SRE among other things, there's always a balance, right? Of I want to make all the things stable, so we're going to put all of the new features that we've promised our customers on the backlog, and we're going to only work on stability. I imagine there's a little bit of course on the product side you want stability as well. Everybody wants stability, but right. Are you able to have those conversations during the postmortems as you're assigning the priorities and the schedules, or is that something that happens afterwards?
I think that would be an after conversation, not we try to keep the postmortems as pointed as possible
What happened?
to solve the problem and to see what new monitoring we need, to prevent the problem from happening again. After that, teams go amongst themselves and then reorganize their priorities. But yeah.
I was going to say, it's a very similar process, and the action items out of our postmortems pretty much go straight into Jira. I have seen, because the service owning team tends to own the postmortem for that service in PagerDuty, I have seen the service owning teams kind of negotiate where instead of the action item being do exactly the thing that would counter this particular incident, they'll know that they're refactoring the service in 2 sprints anyways, so the item will kind of get changed in the middle. I've seen that be both successful and not.
Yep.
So, but having, again, that's the multiple people in that team kind of sitting there going, what's the right thing to do going forward?
Right. We've been investing a lot in our incident command program. And generally, the people who run incident command are not service owners. So it gives checks and balances in the postmortem because the incident commander runs the postmortem, and the service team then comes back with what they can do to make things better. But it gets around that negotiation a little bit.
So Bruce, you talked a little bit about putting other parts of the organization on call and paging them, as did you, Eric. Does that mean we're doing game days for product managers and sales folks and other folks in our organization, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's something that we've been toying around with, like upping our game on the level of game days, losing an entire AWS region. What does that look like from an incident response perspective? We happened to just practice that a couple weeks ago, but
Everybody in the room had that experience.
but I think that's don't wait for the next one, right? I think what's unique, a little bit unique about us in our incident management is we actually have 2 separate roles. We have an incident commander who's very focused on the traditional incident command coordinate the attack. But we actually have a separate role that's all comms focus. It's communications focus. So it's about understanding how the customer is impacted, how we need to communicate to our customers about this impact, and how do we actually be helpful in that case. And that's actually a really good role for a product manager. Product manager should understand the kind of terminology of your said product and what is wrong and what is not working. And so we found that's a pretty good role for product managers.
Other folks on Chris?
Yeah, so we take a similar approach. So have somebody focused on customer communication, assessing the impact, and then have a team of people focused on driving closure to the issue, and following up on the earlier discussion. Really get a solid postmortem that you could actually sit in a room, invite everybody over, and have a brown bag, and present. This is a learning experience. Learn from it. So and get feedback from the rest of the teams as you're prioritizing the follow-ups.
So I'm curious. I think does everybody on stage run some sort of a game day or test failure testing? We know Bruce does. Him and James gave us a fairly long talk about that earlier. But the rest of y'all.
Sure. One of the pain points for us would always be database failovers. If it's painful, do it more. Just keep doing it. Doing it over and over. So.
You just said break things more.
Yeah, I broke my mic. Game day for the mic.
I don't know if we have HA mics in here, but we'll work that out.
Just lean over.
You're on the Fastly end. You're, as Bruce was talking about earlier, he mentioned Netflix is 35% of the internet. I imagine that Fastly is, somewhere in that range. I won't ask you to quote numbers, but that's QAing at that scale is probably tough. So how?
We don't do any actual game days. I think the natural course of the internet provides us plenty of opportunities to troubleshoot. There's a number of different things we have to tackle on any given day. I think we're looking into how to make things better, always long term, and especially as we move more towards cloud services. We can do more in our control plane in that type of area, and all the hardware on the edge stuff. We try to run those as hot as we possibly can. So it's hard to say take one out, right now for fun, because chances are it's going to come into some problem, some S3 thing will go down, or there'll be something out there that will affect us.
So I'm just curious. I mean, we've heard. It sounds like we have 100% game day participation on our implementation here on the stage, to some extent or another, depending on your organization. I'm just curious from the audience, how many of you all are running? I mean, earlier we learned that pretty much everybody's running postmortems. How many of you are actually running game days and introducing this type of failure or chaos in production? So I see Mia's raising her hand. Cool. So I hope by the next time we're doing Datadog Summit here, whether it's on the East Coast or here on the West Coast, we'll see way more hands. It's I imagine if we came here about a year ago, we'd have heard the same thing about some of the other, whether it had been postmortems or some of the other lessons that we talked about today. So I hope we'll be able to see more of that as time moves on. So I've heard the sort of cloud provider outages alluded to 2 or 3 times since we got started here today. And I imagine that's a whole different ball of wax when you are the cloud, both in that you're depending on these services underneath you that you're looking to provide several nines of SLA to your customers, even if sometimes the folks underneath you may not offer that. There's also, I'm looking around the stage and I can just see the interdependencies between the 4 cloud providers that I'm looking at. Datadog probably detects an issue, which then Eric dutifully tries to page you on, but in turn calls up Bruce, who makes the call for him, and then you all come back to look at your Datadog dashboards, who are powered by Fastly. So it's, and I'm sure if I go down the line here, it's sort of the same way, just in different directions. So. How has this impacted how has this impacted the ways that you're designing your services for failure, that you're running your game days? Where does this, you have this responsibility to wake me up at night when things break, or on the folks in this audience, and to be available. So how do we make sure that we do that reliably when we have these entanglements?
Yeah, at PagerDuty and pretty much for any of these services, you kind of have to control your dependencies, or they'll control you. If you don't have any mechanism to prevent or to mitigate issues, you will only be the sum or whatever it is of the SLAs of the services you're depending on. So especially at PagerDuty, we do multiple services. So we use Twilio and not Twilio for we do these things so that we can make sure that we can always meet our commitment to our customers, and then circuit breaker patterns and things like that, so that we can make that decision either automated or manually.
And actually, I can only be a PagerDuty customer because PagerDuty uses our competitors also as fallback. If that wasn't the case, then I couldn't. And so that's actually one of the things that we do. And whenever we talk to any SaaS vendor, is a technical due diligence call. And so that's asking about which providers you're in. How do you handle this certain situation? And so whether you're completely resilient to everything or not, right? It's actually knowing where your failure zones are in your SaaS providers, and then making a conscious decision as a purchaser, as a customer. Okay, this is acceptable. Like, now I might be looking for another vendor to supplement this that has a completely different failure zone than my primary. So.
And it's pretty important to incorporate those failure models in your game day and practice it, and don't just have a plan, actually test the plan.
If I recall correctly, Datadog monitors Datadog, right? So
this is true. There's some other systems at play.
Yes, yes, but there's this is something you would have to think about a bit, right?
Yeah.
So cool. Josh, I think any sort of closing thoughts there?
I think for us, it's we've done special contracts with everybody that sorry, you guys are Fastly users, you cannot cache us.
Yeah.
That way we're not relying on our own systems to let us know if something's wrong. Just becomes the snake eating its tail, and you never get anything right. So I think with most everybody up here, we have that special contract in place, and most of our monitoring groups do. And it's been one of those exciting things to see, but also very frustrating that every single SaaS vendor I've been talking to recently is also like, we're also a customer, this could be great. Well, all right, now we got to work around that a little bit if we want to be able to use it.
As I think about, I think about things like Fastly, you don't always realize that you're necessarily depending on you, right? If I recall correctly, you provide you provide CDN service for things like, for many of the open source repositories out there as well. So things like rubygems.org or, some of the other services that we all just assume like, yep, I will apt-get or gem install or, pip install or whatever it might be. And you realize that's actually, yourself. So, on that, I'll open it up. I'd love to open it up to some, Q&A from the audience as well. But, with that in mind, I'm just curious, have you had, what are the types of strategies you've had to take in terms of your deployments or your operations in order to, on the one end, we're all SaaS providers, we're all cloud providers. We want to make sure that, we're eating our own dog food and doing what we preach, which is, outsource some of these services that are maybe not core to our business, but that we think others can, maybe do better based on their expertise. At the same time, you have this sort of other challenge, which is you are the cloud. How do you make sure that you can work in isolation? So are there things that you're doing there that maybe the rest of us take for granted?
I'm not sure exactly there. I think, we run multiple providers, multiple data centers over multiple peering points. And, so I think as long as the complete internet is not fundamentally broken, you'll be able to get to us somewhere. We're very, very careful about deploys. We do a lot of canary work. We happen to have a lot of POPs that go into interesting areas, which allow us for canaries. We're getting larger in Australia. We just launched South Africa, in Brazil. So you have some that you can kind of test small amounts of traffic with easy fallback points. Back to Miami or back to something that's larger. And so we do a lot of canary releases, and we do very small releases as much as possible to make sure that we're not putting out some gigantic thing that's going to fall over that we have to then tear apart and figure out what happened. Try to just limit the number of changes in each release and increase the number of releases. I think overall it actually still takes us 2 to 3 weeks to deploy a new cache software and new updates out for that, because we roll so slowly to make sure that everybody's safe.
On that, I was going to say on that note, I think the thing that we all share as cloud providers is, I think we really understand the value proposition of reliability, and that reliability is actually something we're selling, and that's not secondary to the product. That is primary to our offering as a cloud provider. And I've definitely, I think that was one of the most refreshing things when I joined Twilio, to see how refreshing, everyone was the priority around resilience and reliability was there. And it doesn't come second to product. That is what we're selling. We're selling this. We're selling reliability. So.
And I think, as you brought up, that we've all mentioned the big cloud outage, the fresh wound from a couple weeks ago. I think the reason that is so impactful to us is, when was the last time before that S3 went down? It just became it's like breathing. It's been around so long that
you just assume that it will be there, like the sun coming up in the morning and the moon coming up at night. Yep.
So it's one of those things where it's absolutely, you've gotten too used to, if a service has 100% uptime, it doesn't. It just means it hasn't failed lately.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that becomes one of those ideal victims for the next game day or the next automated failure injection.
It's like the overdue volcano.
Yep.
Also, if you bring their SLAs down proactively, then you make sure that your software is resilient to that.